Hey everybody, Professor G here, and I want to start off our class talking about what I like to start off with every class talking about, and that is the issue of historical methodology. Now, before we begin this discussion of historical methodology, I'd like to also talk about one of my other favorite subjects, the existence of extraterrestrials. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not extraterrestrials exist on some foreign planet out there in space that we don't quite know about yet. No, rather I'm talking about the type of extraterrestrial, the type of aliens that fly around in flying saucers and abduct rednecks and cows and probe them and do other sorts of research on them. I read an article recently by a Dr. Littleton, or Dr. Little, I believe it's Littleton. Dr. Littleton about, he is arguing for an idea called the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Dr. Littleton was the expert advisor for a History Channel show that you may have seen called Ancient Aliens. In this article, Dr. Littleton argues that extraterrestrials have been in contact with humanity for about the past 100,000 to 50,000 years or so. Not only have extraterrestrials been in contact with humanity, but at certain points in human history, extraterrestrials have intervened in human affairs and given human beings something, whether it's technology, whether it's political ideas, what have you. At certain points in time, they've intervened and given human beings something that maybe they weren't supposed to have. Maybe the other aliens didn't want them to have. A prime example of this, according to the ancient astronaut hypothesis, is the construction of the pyramids of Giza. I'm sure you've all know about those or have seen pictures about those. According to the ancient astronaut hypothesis, it is simply impossible for the ancient Egyptians to have constructed such buildings, and therefore the only reasonable conclusion is that the ancient Egyptians were given some sort of alien technology, the sort of advanced technology needed to construct these buildings. Now, at this point in the lecture, you're probably wondering, what the hell is this guy talking about? It's actually a common response to many of my lectures. And you would be correct to think that. If you were not thinking that, and if you have agreed with everything I said thus far, then I apologize in advance. The reason why I started off talking about Dr. Littleton's ideas is because with this issue of historical methodology, what we were going to be doing for the most part is talking about what I believe the difference is between history on the one hand and pseudo-history on the other. But before we do that, Dr. Littleton's ideas brings up the issue of credibility. The issue of credibility. How do you know if what you are reading or what you are watching is from a credible source or from a credible person? Now, this is a really big problem for us nowadays due to the availability of information. We live in what's called the information age. Information on any given topic is just a few Google clicks away, right? All we got to do is just go to Google, type in a historical date or historical event, and then all of a sudden we have this whole list of pages providing us with a almost infinite amount of information about that topic. But this also presents information overload, right? To the novice who has no idea how to distinguish between a credible or an uncredible source, this amount of information is a bit daunting. And typically what people do is they just click on the first link they find, read about it, and assume that's what everybody believes about the subject. The problem is if you type in something like ancient aliens, you might come across Dr. Littleton's website, and when you read Dr. Littleton's argument, you may say, okay, well, he's got a doctor in front of his name, so he must know what he's talking about, right? This is the problem of credibility. When you stumble across a source, how can you tell if it's actually a good source? Before we begin, there's actually a few little tricks you can use right off the bat if you struggle with this. as I do on a regular basis. Most history books, most history shows, hopefully, and most lectures that I'm going to be giving is based on the opinion of experts. An expert is somebody who has a specialty in the area that you're reading about or the area about that you're studying about. Somebody who has the right education. Somebody who spent years studying a particular subject. Somebody who has written articles that have been reviewed by other experts in that field. An expert, that's what we mean by an expert. Somebody who is a trusted judge of opinion. Now, experts can't always trust the opinions of experts, right? Dr. Littleton has a doctor in front of his name because he is an expert at something. Specifically, Dr. Littleton's an expert at comparative mythology. In fact, he's written several books on the subjects. He's published numerous articles on the subjects. So by any measure that we wish to apply to experts, Dr. Littleton is an expert. So why should you not trust him? Or rather, I guess, why is expert, the title of expert, sometimes deceptive? That's because you run into some problems, right? Sometimes experts write outside of their area of expertise. For example, somebody could study for the past 15 years to be a heart doctor, right? You feel some sort of chest pain, you go to the hospital, and most likely you'll speak with a doctor who specializes in the thoracic region, or maybe who specializes just in the heart, right? What wouldn't happen, hopefully, and if it does, alert somebody, right? You wouldn't have like a plastic surgeon come in and start speaking to you about your heart problems. Why? Because that's not his area of expertise. Okay, so you want to make sure that the person whose article you're reading or whose shows you're watching is giving advice, is telling you something within their realm and domain of knowledge, right? You wouldn't go to a car mechanic to get your refrigerator fixed, right? You got to make sure that the person has experience in that field. Okay, you also want to make sure that that expert has a good reputation in the community, that this expert isn't somebody who's shunned by the rest of his community. Okay, so perhaps you come to my office, for example, and I tell you that ancient Greek history is made up, that it's not real, that you've just been told that in order to get you to buy into this notion of Western superiority or something along those lines. A majority of historians would disagree with me for obvious reasons, right? Probably every legitimate historian would say, no, he's just wrong. So you want to make sure that the expert is accepted in their field. Well, what if all of those criteria are met? What if we have an expert who is accepted, who has the training, who has the professional background? So we'll use Dr. Littleton as an example, right? He meets all of these criteria that we lay out, right? So what exactly, if anything, is wrong with his argument? And I would say that what is wrong with his argument lies within the area of historical methodology, that there is something methodologically wrong with the ancient astronaut hypothesis, at least within the realm of history. Okay, so we dealt with the issue of credibility, but before we deal with historical method, I think the natural question we want to ask, or I would like to ask you, is what do you think history is? What is history? Now, if you were in class here with me today and I went around the room and I said, what do you think history is? What do you think history is? A common response that I often get when I actually have in classes people in the class, is that history is the story of humanity, that history is the story of our past, right? And that's a very good response. And for the most part, that is correct. Another question I like to ask is, can we actually know the past? Because when I ask you what is history, that's a deceptively simple question, right? It's deceptive because, for example, some people would say, well, whose history are we talking about? Are we talking about American history, the history of the United States? But there's also the history of Africa. There's the history of the Middle East, the history of Asia. So we can say, well, wait a minute, whose history are we talking about? Another thing is, who's writing this history, right? Because they might have a bias that we can think of. A lot of people are familiar with the expression, history is written by the victors, right? And for the most part, that's true. So can we trust these people's judgment? Can we really know the past if it is written with these biases in mind? And I would answer yes, for the most part. We can be relatively certain of our knowledge of the past due to the fact of historical methodology, particularly this method that I've laid out. I think that you could trust history as long as the history you are reading abides by these particular criteria. Also, if you accept these criteria, I also think that we can rule out things like the ancient astronaut hypothesis that I would classify, in fact, as pseudo-history. All right, so let's talk about this historical method. Now, this is my professional interpretation of the historical method. Obviously, there's going to be some historians out there that would disagree with me, but I'm up for the argument, and I think that that is a conversation that needs to be had, right? But anyway, this is kind of a vague framework of what I think historical method, the criteria by which people ought to write history, how we ought to do history. Okay, so first of all, we have facts. A historical fact is simply a historical event, any event which has occurred in the past. And for our sake, it's the accumulation of events that have happened in the world throughout history. Now, so it's any events, right? And one time I was giving this lecture and one of my students said, well, I stumped my toe yesterday. Is that a historical fact? To which I would say, yes, it is. It's not a very important historical fact, but it is an event that happened in the past. As we'll see, historical facts and historical narratives share a symbiotic relationship. They are intimately tied together. Why? Because as we'll see, historical narrative gives meaning to historical facts. So a fact is any event which has occurred in the past. Now, historical facts are a bit tricky because there's two elements that I want to talk about to historical facts. The first of all is that historical facts are contingent. Historical facts are contingent. Contingency is a logical term. Contingency as opposed to necessity. So what do I mean when I say that historical facts are contingent? Let me begin with a few examples and maybe this will make sense. Basically, all it means is that it is possible to think of historical facts as being otherwise. Okay, so when I was in elementary school, perhaps you learned this the same way as I did. When I was in elementary school, typically around Thanksgiving, I was taught the little rhyme, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So that's a historical fact. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So when I say that that fact is contingent, I mean that it is possible for us to think of that fact as being different or perhaps as not occurring at all. All right, so let me give you an example. Okay, so we have here possible world 1, possible world 2, and possible world 3. Let's say that possible world 1 is our world, the world that we live in, the actual world. In the actual world, Columbus did set sail in 1492, as we all know. But it's easy for us to imagine another world in which Columbus, for example, may have set sailed. Let's put 1492 here, and the C will represent Columbus. Perhaps there's another world in which Columbus set sailed in 1493. Impossible World 2. In Impossible World 3, it's easy for us to imagine that Columbus never existed at all. Maybe somebody else set sail. Maybe no one set sail. Maybe North America was never discovered by the West. Who knows, right? But when I say that a historical fact is contingent, all I mean is that it is possible for us to imagine that fact to be otherwise, to be different somehow. So it's possible for us to imagine a world in which Columbus never existed. So historical facts are contingent. And this will play an important role when we talk about historical narratives, which I will get to. Okay, so remember, historical facts, any event which happens in the past, historical facts are contingent. Also, historical facts, they always come with strings attached. Okay, what do I mean by that? So, historical facts never occur in a vacuum. They never occur by themselves, right? We can't just pick out one historical fact from the timeline of history and examine it by itself, right? Historical facts always have strings attached. You can't separate a historical fact from the larger historical context. So when we're talking about Christopher Columbus setting sail and being the first Westerner to discover the Americas, we can't separate that from Columbus's political context, from his social context, from his cultural context, from his religious, from his economic, so on and so forth. There's always other facts, an almost infinite number of other facts tied in to any single historical fact that we talk about. We could talk about the type of ship Columbus used. We could talk about the type of technology that went into building that ship. We could talk about the lives of his crew members, whatever. Okay, so anytime we talk and anytime we single out a single historical fact, just keep in mind that there are, a almost infinite number of other facts that correspond to that. Okay, historical ideas never occur in a vacuum. Always be mindful of historical context. My second methodological point is the use of historical narrative. Now, I said before that historical facts only make sense unless we have a historical narrative. Now, a narrative you can think of as a story. A narrative is what the historian utilizes in order to tell you about the facts. A narrative is the historian's interpretation of the facts, and a narrative is what makes sense of the facts. So you can think of, to use another illustration, let's say all these different dots are historical facts, right? And you have a million of these dots. What the historian does with his narrative is he connects the dots to make some sort of coherent shape, to make some sort of coherent idea of the facts. You can think of like a jigsaw puzzle with each individual little piece being a historical fact. And once you put all these pieces of the puzzle together, it creates a bigger picture. That's what historical narrative does. Now, by critical analysis, what I mean, I mentioned before maybe the process of peer review. So when I say any historical methodology has to have critical analysis, what I basically mean is that any historical methodology has to incorporate other people interpreting, other people critically analyzing any and every historical claim, right? In almost every discipline, we have this process of peer review. So say I write a paper on the Civil War. I think I'm making a really good argument for why Abraham Lincoln wasn't really that great of a president during the Civil War. So what I do is I write the paper, I send it off to a journal, and then what happens? Other historians who specialize in that area read my paper and then say whether or not it checks out. They'll say either, okay, well, you made a pretty good argument here, or they'll say, no, that's complete trash. Just, that's just garbage. Okay, that's what I mean by peer review, is having other experts from the same field critically analyze your argument. And this critical analysis is based upon critical thinking, based upon the rules and the laws of logic, right? Any historical narrative has to be logically consistent. Why? Because we live in a world that is, as far as we can tell, logically consistent. Okay, and for the fourth point, we have what I call historical naturalism. What I mean by that is any historical narrative that is written today has to be committed to a form of historical naturalism. Naturalism being opposed to what? Supernaturalism, right? Anytime a modern day historian writes a narrative, they have to frame that narrative within the context of human actions or environmental conditions or whatever other natural phenomenon that they can think of that caused or influenced these historical events. For example, if I'm writing a history of, let's say I'm trying to answer the question, what caused World War I? And I'm writing a historical narrative of what I believed caused World War I. What I mean by historical naturalism is that my narrative has to draw from the political actions that went into the start of World War I. I could talk about politics. I could talk about technology. Maybe I want to talk about the environmental condition. I could talk about European imperialism. I could talk about whatever else I want to, as long as I'm still within the context of human actions, as long as my narrative is framed and explained by human actions, right? I can't say that World War I started because an alien from planet X that hides behind our sun controlled the minds of the European leaders and made them go to war, right? That's not a naturalistic explanation. Okay, so that's all that I mean by naturalism. So let's go back to our ancient alien hypothesis and ask whether or not it checks out. So according to my methodology here. First of all, historical facts. What sort of evidence does the ancient astronaut hypothesis draw upon? Well, once you analyze the type of evidence that they're using historical evidence such as the pyramids of Giza, such as the construction of ancient buildings. But if you notice, all of it is indirect evidence. It doesn't actually count as evidence in and of itself. All they're doing is saying, well, if you look at this fact according to our narrative, then it makes sense, right? Because the pyramids of Giza exist. They date back to the time of the ancient Egyptians, and we have historical records, and we have archaeological evidence to suggest that the ancient Egyptians built them. So they don't have historical facts on their side. It's all indirect facts. It's facts that we can't actually test out. It's facts that we can't actually interpret, right? Because it's all based on other facts. Second of all, we have historical narrative. Now, I will give them this point, right? There is a narrative that goes along that aliens throughout human history have intervened along the timeline in order to assist humanity, in order to give humanity some sort of technology, so on and so forth. However, their narrative doesn't do well in its interpretation of the facts. It doesn't draw us a clear picture, right? The picture it draws us is of a kind of a fast and loose interpretation of the facts. Okay, can't actually point to anything and say, this is where we can see extraterrestrials come in, right? We haven't found any sort of alien technology lying around the pyramids, right? If the ancient Egyptians were actually given some sort of alien technology, then we should have some sort of evidence of it, right? There should be some sort of facts pointing to it, maybe like a random tool lying on the ground. Instead, what we find is ancient tools that date from the time period in which the pyramids were constructed. Okay. Second of all, does the ancient astronaut hypothesis hold up to critical analysis? Does it hold up with peer review? No. An ancient astronaut hypothesis has never been published in any credible history journal, not that I'm aware of. Okay. Maybe I'm wrong. Does it hold up to logical scrutiny? I don't think so. There's a logical fallacy called the argument from ignorance, which I think the ancient astronaut hypothesis doesn't directly commit, but I think it comes really close, and I think there's something there, right? An argument from ignorance is, simply put, an argument from ignorance claims that since you cannot disprove something, that it somehow lends credibility to this other thing. Okay? So the ancient astronaut hypothesis basically states, since you cannot disprove the existence of extraterrestrials, since you cannot disprove the idea that extraterrestrials intervened in the past in human history, that somehow this lends credibility to the idea that they did, in fact, intervene in human history. Or, put another way, since there is no explanation, since we can't say exactly how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, therefore this somehow lends credibility to the idea that they were able to build it due to alien technology. You see what's happening there, right? So we don't know exactly how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, but that doesn't mean that this lends any sort of credence to the idea that aliens helped them build it, right? Maybe they had some sort of tool or technique that has been lost to history, right? Just because we can't explain exactly how they did it doesn't mean that they didn't do it, okay? And fourth, the issue of historical naturalism. Okay, so their narrative employs something that is supernatural, namely extraterrestrials. Okay, extraterrestrials fall outside the realm of natural things, right? Because we don't even know if they're out there. Maybe they are, but that doesn't mean that they can provide a naturalistic explanation for historical events. All right, well, thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you soon.